Space is the most hostile environment humans have ever entered. A vacuum where unprotected human beings die within seconds, where temperatures swing from 250 degrees to minus 250 degrees, depending on whether you're in sunlight or shadow, and where the nearest help is at minimum 250 miles straight down. You might think that people selected from millions of applicants, trained for years and monitored by thousands of ground controllers, would be immune to stupid mistakes. Then there were these incidents which proved that even the most elite humans in history can make errors that nearly kill them when they're floating in the deadliest environment imaginable. Buckle your 5-point harness for a terrifying masterclass in how astronauts nearly died in space, often for the dumbest reasons imaginable. 1. In 1965, Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov conducted humanity's first spacewalk and nearly became humanity's first spacewalk fatality when his spacesuit inflated like a balloon in the vacuum of space, becoming so rigid he couldn't bend his arms or legs to return to the airlock. The suit had been designed and tested on Earth, where atmospheric pressure pushed back against the suit's internal pressure, but in the vacuum of space, nothing resisted the suit's expansion. Leonov floated helplessly outside Voskhod 2, unable to fit back through the airlock hatch because his suit had expanded beyond the hatch dimensions. With oxygen running low and his body temperature rising dangerously from exertion, Leonov made a desperate decision. He partially depressurized his own suit, risking decompression sickness and death, to deflate it enough to squeeze back inside. He barely made it, suffering from agonizing joint pain from nitrogen bubbles in his blood. The Soviets nearly killed their most famous cosmonaut because nobody had fully tested how spacesuits behave in actual space. 2. During the Apollo 11 mission, Buzz Aldrin accidentally broke the circuit breaker that armed the ascent engine, the only engine that could lift the lunar module off the moon's surface, by bumping it with his backpack while moving around the cramped cabin. The astronauts didn't notice the broken switch until they were preparing to leave the moon. Without that circuit breaker, the engine couldn't fire, and Armstrong and Aldrin would have been stranded on the lunar surface with no possibility of rescue while the world watched. Aldrin fixed the problem by jamming a felt-tip pen into the broken switch housing to complete the circuit. The first moon landing nearly became the first moon deaths because an astronaut bumped into a critical switch and happened to have a pen that fit the hole. 3. In 1997, a Russian cosmonaut aboard the Mir space station accidentally crashed a Progress cargo ship into the station during a manual docking test, puncturing the Spectre module and causing rapid depressurization. The collision happened because ground controllers wanted to test manual docking procedures, and the cosmonaut misjudged closing speed and distance without functioning radar. The crew had seconds to seal the damaged module before the entire station lost atmosphere. They scrambled through the station, cutting cables that ran through the hatch so they could close it, losing significant atmosphere before finally isolating the breach. One crew member later described the sound of air rushing out as the most terrifying thing I've ever heard. The near disaster happened because someone decided to practice manual docking with an actual space station rather than in a simulator. 4. In 1966, the Gemini 8 mission nearly killed Neil Armstrong and David Scott when a thruster stuck in the on position, sending the spacecraft into a violent spin that reached 1 revolution per second. The crew experienced such severe disorientation and G-forces that they were approaching loss of consciousness. Armstrong, fighting to stay alert, made the split-second decision to shut down the orbital attitude and maneuvering system entirely and activate the re-entry control system to stop the spin, a decision that saved their lives but required aborting the mission and making an emergency splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. The stuck thruster was caused by an electrical short that nobody had anticipated, and Armstrong's quick thinking under extreme physical stress demonstrated why he would later be chosen to command Apollo 11. The mission nearly ended in death because of a short circuit in a single thruster. 5. In 1997, a fire broke out aboard the Mir space station when a cosmonaut ignited an oxygen-generating canister as part of routine operations. The canister, designed to produce breathable oxygen through a chemical reaction, instead shot flames across the module like a blowtorch, blocking the path to one of the 2 Soyuz escape capsules. For 14 terrifying minutes, The crew fought a fire in an environment where smoke had nowhere to go, where opening a window wasn't an option, and where their only escape routes were potentially cut off. The fire eventually burned out, but not before filling the station with toxic smoke and terrifying everyone aboard. Investigation revealed the oxygen canisters had a manufacturing defect that made them prone to combustion, and the crew had been lighting potential bombs every time they activated life support. 6. During Apollo 13, the famous "Houston, we've had a problem" moment occurred when an oxygen tank exploded in the service module, crippling the spacecraft and nearly killing 3 astronauts 200,000 miles from Earth. But the explosion itself wasn't simply bad luck. It resulted from a cascade of human errors that sent the crew into space with a bomb hidden in their spacecraft. Years before the mission, technicians accidentally damaged the tank's internal wiring during ground testing when they dropped the tank assembly. The damage wasn't detected during inspection. Later, supervisors approved flying the damaged tank anyway, after it passed pressure tests, not realizing the internal wiring was compromised. During pre-launch preparations, ground controllers ran a procedure that required heating the tank to remove oxygen, but the damaged wiring overheated far beyond safe temperatures for hours, degrading the insulation without anyone noticing, because the temperature gauges only read to a certain maximum. When the tank was finally activated in space, the damaged, overheated wiring sparked and ignited the pure oxygen inside, causing an explosion that ripped open the service module and vented the spacecraft's oxygen supply into space. The crew survived through incredible ingenuity, desperate improvisation, and a measure of luck. But they nearly died 200,000 miles from Earth because of a dropped tank, a paperwork decision, and a ground test procedure that nobody realized was slowly creating the conditions for an explosion. 7. In 1985, Space Shuttle Discovery astronaut Jeffrey Hoffman was performing maintenance on a malfunctioning satellite during a spacewalk when his foot slipped from its restraint, and he began floating away from the shuttle with no way to propel himself back. His tether had become tangled in equipment, and for several terrifying seconds he drifted into the void, with Earth spinning slowly below him, the shuttle getting smaller in his field of view, and nothing but infinite emptiness in every other direction. In space, there's no friction, no air resistance. Once you start moving away from your spacecraft, you keep moving away forever unless something stops you. Hoffman couldn't swim back because there was nothing to push against. His crewmate David Griggs saw what was happening and grabbed Hoffman's tether, pulling him back to safety before he drifted beyond reach. The incident lasted only seconds but demonstrated how easily an astronaut could become untethered and float away to die in the infinite emptiness, slowly suffocating as their oxygen ran out while watching their spacecraft shrink to a dot and then disappear. The near miss happened because Hoffman had positioned himself incorrectly for the task he was performing, and hadn't double-checked his tether attachment before beginning work. A moment of carelessness nearly turned into an eternal drift into nothing. 8. Soviet cosmonaut Valery Polyakov, who holds the record for longest single spaceflight at 437 consecutive days in orbit aboard Mir, nearly died not in space but immediately after returning to Earth, when he ignored medical advice and exercised too aggressively after landing. His muscles and cardiovascular system had adapted so completely to weightlessness over 14 months that the sudden return to Earth's gravity placed enormous strain on a body that had forgotten how to function under load. Doctors had explicitly warned him to take it extremely easy during his first days back on Earth, to avoid sudden movements, to let medical personnel help him with everything. But Polyakov wanted to prove that long-duration spaceflight didn't cause debilitating weakness that would prevent future Mars missions, so he insisted on walking from the landing capsule under his own power, and pushed himself during post-landing physical assessments. His heart, which hadn't had to pump blood against gravity in over a year, nearly failed from the strain. He experienced dangerous arrhythmias and required emergency medical intervention that his stubbornness had made necessary. The longest spaceflight in human history nearly killed its occupant, not through any space hazard, but through the cosmonauts' determination to prove a point about human endurance by ignoring the medical professionals trying to keep him alive. 9. In 2013, Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano nearly drowned during a spacewalk outside the International Space Station when water began leaking into his helmet from the spacesuit's cooling system. What started as an annoying trickle of cold water against the back of his neck quickly became a terrifying flood that spread across his face, covered his eyes, filled his ears so he couldn't hear radio communications, and entered his nose, making it nearly impossible to breathe without inhaling water. In the vacuum of space, Parmitano couldn't simply take off his helmet to clear the water. Removing his helmet would have killed him instantly from decompression. He had to navigate back to the airlock essentially blind, following his safety tether by feel while water continued accumulating and sloshing around his head with every movement. The water formed a growing bubble around his face because it couldn't drain in microgravity. It just clung to whatever surface it touched and kept growing. Parmitano later said he began preparing mentally for the possibility of drowning, unable to believe he might die from water in the vacuum of space. He made it back inside with water covering most of his face and head, moments away from potentially inhaling enough to drown. The near drowning happened because of a contaminated water separator in the suit's cooling system that had clogged and begun forcing water into the helmet ventilation circuit. A failure mode nobody had anticipated and that pre-EVA checks hadn't detected. An astronaut almost drowned in space because a filter got dirty. 10. During the Apollo 10 mission, the final dress rehearsal before the moon landing, the lunar module descent stage was accidentally jettisoned while still attached to the ascent stage during a staging maneuver, causing the spacecraft to suddenly tumble violently end over end in a motion so violent that astronauts Thomas Stafford and Eugene Cernan could barely see their instruments through the spinning visual field. The horizon whipped through their windows at a nauseating rate, warning lights flashed across every panel, and both astronauts fought to understand what had gone wrong and how to fix it before they lost control entirely or crashed into the lunar surface below them. The tumble was caused by a switch being in the wrong position. Someone had set the abort guidance system to automatic when it should have been attitude hold, meaning the computer was fighting against pilot inputs and causing the wild gyrations. Cernan later described the moment as the closest he ever came to dying in his astronaut career, saying he thought the spacecraft was going to crash into the moon while they watched helplessly. Stafford regained control using manual thruster inputs, canceling the automated system's confused commands with brute force piloting. The mission rehearsing the moon landing almost killed its crew 8 miles above the lunar surface because of a switch setting error that took seconds to make and nearly took lives to correct. 11. In 1971, the Soyuz 11 crew, Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev, successfully completed a record-setting 23-day stay aboard the Salyut 1 space station, becoming heroes of the Soviet space program and demonstrating that humans could live and work in space for extended periods. They died during re-entry when a pressure equalization valve opened prematurely at high altitude, depressurizing their capsule while they were still far too high to survive exposure to the near-vacuum conditions outside. The crew wasn't wearing spacesuits because Soviet engineers had decided the Soyuz capsule was too small for 3 suited cosmonauts, and they had removed the life support equipment that would have been needed for suits to allow a 3rd crew member. This decision was made to allow larger crews and achieve propaganda victories over the American program, despite the obvious risk that cabin depressurization would kill an unsuited crew instantly. The crew couldn't reach the valve that had opened because it was located behind their seats. Ground controllers didn't realize anything was wrong until the capsule landed and recovery teams opened the hatch to find all 3 men dead in their seats, still strapped in with peaceful expressions, as if they'd simply fallen asleep. They had died within seconds of the valve opening, probably before they even understood what was happening. The tragedy wasn't strictly astronaut error, but the decision to fly without suits to save space was a calculated gamble that Soviet leadership made and that killed 3 men. All subsequent Soyuz missions have required pressure suits during launch and re-entry. 12. In 2001, the crew of Space Shuttle Discovery accidentally left a vent open during ascent, allowing the cabin to partially depressurize without anyone immediately noticing because the pressure drop was gradual. The crew experienced headaches, difficulty concentrating, and unusual fatigue, classic symptoms of hypoxia or oxygen deprivation, before someone finally noticed the open vent indicator and closed the valve. The shuttle had climbed to an altitude where the partial pressure loss, if it had continued, could have caused loss of consciousness and eventually death from suffocation. The crew would have simply gotten progressively sleepier and more confused until they passed out, unaware they were dying because hypoxia doesn't feel like suffocation. It feels like comfortable drowsiness. The vent was supposed to be closed during a specific checklist item early in the ascent sequence, but someone had either missed the item entirely or incorrectly marked it as complete without actually performing the action. A simple checklist error, a skipped line, or an unchecked box nearly killed an entire shuttle crew through slow suffocation they wouldn't have noticed until too late. 13. Astronaut Michael Collins, orbiting the moon alone in the Apollo 11 command module, while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the lunar surface 60 miles below, nearly became stranded in lunar orbit when mission controllers discovered a troubling anomaly in the service propulsion system, the main engine that would fire to bring the spacecraft out of lunar orbit and back toward Earth. The engine's backup steering system showed oscillations that suggested potential instability, possibly indicating a problem that could cause the engine to fire unpredictably or fail entirely during the critical trans-Earth injection burn. Collins would have had to attempt a solo return to Earth using backup procedures that had never been tested in actual flight, while his crewmates on the surface would have had to attempt their own return in the lunar module ascent stage and try to rendezvous with a command module piloted by a crew of 1 rather than 3. Mission controllers worked frantically to understand the oscillations, running simulations and consulting with engineering teams, while Collins waited in orbit, alone behind the moon where radio communication was impossible, genuinely uncertain whether he would see Earth again. The anomaly turned out to be a sensor error rather than an actual engine problem, and the return flight proceeded normally. But for several hours, the first man to orbit the moon alone faced the possibility of becoming the most isolated person in history who would either make it home solo or not at all. 14. In 1984, Space Shuttle Challenger astronaut Bruce McCandless became the first human to perform an untethered spacewalk using the Manned Maneuvering Unit, essentially a nitrogen-powered jetpack that allowed him to fly freely away from the shuttle without any physical connection to safety. McCandless flew over 320 feet from the orbiter, farther than any human had ever been from their spacecraft without a lifeline, with nothing but the jetpack between him and eternal drift into the void. If the jetpack had malfunctioned, if a thruster had stuck, if the nitrogen had run out, if the controls had failed, McCandless would have slowly drifted away until his oxygen ran out, completely unable to be rescued because the shuttle couldn't maneuver quickly enough to catch a tumbling astronaut. He would have watched the shuttle get smaller and smaller until it disappeared, spending his final hours alone in a way no human had ever been alone before. The jetpack worked perfectly, and the images of McCandless floating free against the black backdrop of space became some of the most iconic photographs in NASA history. But the decision to test the device by flying a person to a distance where rescue was essentially impossible represented a calculated risk that could have created the first person to die completely alone in the infinite emptiness of open space. 15. During a 1965 Gemini mission, astronaut Frank Borman's heart rate dropped to dangerously low levels during a sleep period when the spacecraft's automatic attitude control system malfunctioned and began venting thruster fuel, slowly rotating the capsule into an orientation that put the crew compartment in continuous shadow. Without sunlight hitting the spacecraft, temperatures inside dropped steadily toward freezing while Borman slept. He entered a near hypothermic state, his metabolism slowing to dangerous levels as his body tried to conserve heat. His crewmate Jim Lovell woke first, probably because he was positioned where some residual heat from equipment kept him slightly warmer, and realized something was wrong when he couldn't wake Borman and noticed ice crystals forming on the cabin walls and instrument panels. Quick action stabilized the spacecraft's attitude and brought it back into sunlight, gradually warming the cabin, but a few more hours of malfunction might have resulted in a crew member freezing to death in Earth orbit without anyone on the ground, understanding what was happening until it was too late to help. 16. In 1969, Soviet cosmonaut Boris Volynov survived a re-entry so violent that he bit completely through his own lip, was thrown around his restraints until his body was covered with bruises, and fully expected to die before reaching the ground. His Soyuz 5 capsule failed to separate properly from its service module, causing it to enter the atmosphere in the wrong orientation, with the heat shield pointing away from the direction of travel rather than toward it. The capsule tumbled violently, exposing the non-protected sections to re-entry heating that was never supposed to touch them. Volanov watched through his porthole as flames licked around the capsule, saw material burning away from sections that weren't designed to handle heat, and prepared himself mentally for the moment when the hull would burn through and kill him. The violent tumble continued for agonizing minutes, before aerodynamic forces finally tore the service module free and allowed the capsule to right itself with the heat shield forward. Volanov endured G-forces that would have killed most people and suffered injuries that took months to heal. He survived only because the Soyuz capsule was barely robust enough to handle forces, and heating it was never designed to experience. A margin of safety that nobody had planned for, but that saved his life. 17. In 2018, the Soyuz MS-10 mission experienced a booster failure during ascent that triggered an automatic abort sequence, subjecting American astronaut Nick Hague and Russian cosmonaut Alexei Ovchinin to a ballistic re-entry pulling over 6 Gs, 6 times their body weight pressing down on them, as their capsule separated from the failing rocket and plummeted back toward Earth on a steep trajectory. The crew survived the abort and landed safely in Kazakhstan, shaken but uninjured. But investigation revealed the failure was caused by a sensor that had been bent during rocket assembly at the factory, a manufacturing defect that should have been caught during quality control inspection, but wasn't because the inspection process didn't look for that particular type of damage. A bent sensor, something a careful inspector could have caught by simply looking at the rocket assembly, nearly killed 2 people during what was supposed to be a routine launch to the International Space Station. The rocket had flown successfully many times before with sensors that weren't bent, meaning this particular failure mode had never been seen but also had never been specifically checked for. 18. Astronaut Chris Hadfield, who would later become famous for his social media presence from space, experienced temporary blindness during a 2001 spacewalk when anti-fog solution that had been applied to the inside of his helmet visor got into his eyes, causing them to tear up profusely in water. On Earth, this would be painful but manageable. You'd blink, wipe your eyes, and continue with your day. In the microgravity environment of space, tears don't fall down your face. They form a growing blob of water that covers your eye and doesn't go away, just gets larger and spreads across your face as more tears are produced. Hadfield was completely blind outside the space shuttle, hundreds of miles above Earth, unable to see his way back to the airlock, with contaminated anti-fog solution still irritating his eyes and causing more tears to accumulate. He had to make a decision that could have killed him. He opened a purge valve in his helmet to vent some of his air supply to space, reducing pressure inside the helmet enough that the water began to evaporate from his eyes. The partial depressurization risked decompression injury, but it cleared his vision enough to navigate back to the airlock. He survived and completed the spacewalk after the tears cleared, but the mission could have ended in tragedy because someone hadn't properly rinsed the anti-fog solution during suit preparation. 19. During the Apollo 12 mission, the Saturn V rocket was struck by lightning twice during launch, at 36 seconds and again at 52 seconds after liftoff, which caused most of the spacecraft's electrical systems to fail simultaneously in a cascade of warning lights and alarms. The lightning strikes overwhelmed the spacecraft's electrical systems, causing circuit breakers to trip throughout the vehicle. Warning lights filled every panel in the command module, and onboard computers began displaying garbage data instead of flight information. For several terrifying seconds, mission controllers at Houston had no telemetry data and no idea if the spacecraft was controllable or if the crew needed to activate the launch escape system and abort the mission. Flight controller John Aaron, watching his console display meaningless numbers, remembered an obscure anomaly from a test months earlier that had produced similar symptoms. He called up to the spacecraft for the crew to flip a switch labeled SCE to AUX, a command so obscure that even the astronauts had to search their panels to find the switch, and the capsule communicator had to repeat the instruction because he'd never heard of it either. Pete Conrad finally found the switch and flipped it. The electrical systems reset, telemetry was restored, and the mission continued to a successful moon landing. But the decision to launch through clouds that could produce lightning nearly ended the mission before it reached orbit, because nobody had anticipated that lightning could strike a rocket and cause cascading electrical failures throughout every system simultaneously. 20. In 1985, the Space Shuttle Challenger experienced a main engine shutdown during ascent after one of the three main engines failed unexpectedly, forcing the crew to perform an abort to orbit, a contingency procedure where the shuttle reaches a lower-than-planned orbit using the remaining two engines at increased thrust. The failure meant the shuttle couldn't reach its intended altitude and had to perform a shortened mission before landing. The crew was fortunate that only one engine failed. If a second engine had failed at certain points during ascent, the crew would have faced scenarios with names like transatlantic abort landing or return to launch site. Desperate contingency procedures involving landing at emergency strips in Spain, Morocco, or Africa that the crew had never actually seen, or attempting to turn the shuttle around and land back at Kennedy Space Center on a runway they just passed. If multiple engines had failed at the worst possible times, the only option might have been ditching in the Atlantic Ocean, which shuttle crews were not expected to survive. The engine failure was caused by a temperature sensor malfunction that triggered an automatic shutdown even though the engine was actually functioning normally. The engine was fine, but the sensor that monitored it wasn't, and the safety system couldn't tell the difference. 1 year later, Challenger would be destroyed during launch from an unrelated failure, the infamous O-ring failure in the solid rocket booster, killing all 7 crew members and grounding the shuttle program for years. 21. Cosmonaut Georgy Grechko nearly died during a 1970s spacewalk when his cooling system garment, designed to prevent overheating during the physical exertion of working in a spacesuit, developed a leak and began filling with water. Unlike the later Parmitano incident where water accumulated in the helmet, Grechko's water accumulated around his torso, soaking his undergarments and rapidly cooling his body core through direct contact with ice-cold water circulating against his skin. He began shivering uncontrollably, his core temperature dropping toward hypothermic levels. His fingers became numb and clumsy, making it increasingly difficult to operate controls and work latches. He had difficulty operating the airlock controls to get back inside because his hands wouldn't do what his brain commanded. His crewmate, watching through a porthole and seeing Grechko's struggle, talked him through the airlock procedure step by step, providing the guidance Grechko's cold, impaired brain couldn't provide itself. When they finally got him inside and removed his suit, they discovered his entire undergarment was soaked through with water, cold enough to cause tissue damage. A few more minutes outside and Grechko would have lost motor function entirely and been physically unable to return to the airlock under his own power. 22. In 1998, the crew of Space Shuttle Endeavour nearly released a massive satellite communications platform called Spartan, without properly disconnecting all the umbilical connections that linked the satellite to the shuttle's systems. Releasing the satellite with umbilicals attached would have either damaged the shuttle's payload bay, potentially making it impossible to close the bay doors required for re-entry, or dragged the shuttle into a collision with the satellite as the tethers snapped taut. Either scenario could have been fatal to the crew. A last-second call from astronaut Nancy Curry, who noticed an umbilical still attached while watching through a window, stopped the release with literal seconds to spare before the satellite would have been pushed out of the bay. The checklist for satellite deployment had been modified specifically for this particular mission, and the modified procedure contained an error that skipped a disconnection step. Standard operating procedures, carefully developed over years of missions, nearly caused a fatal accident because someone made a paperwork error while adapting the checklist for a slightly different satellite configuration. 23. During the Apollo 16 mission in 1972, a malfunction in the command module's backup steering system for the main engine nearly scrubbed the lunar landing entirely while astronauts John Young and Charlie Duke waited in lunar orbit to begin their descent. The backup system showed oscillations that suggested potential instability that might cause the engine to fire unpredictably during the return to Earth. Mission rules developed before the flight specified that this type of anomaly required aborting the lunar landing and returning directly home rather than risk stranding the lunar module crew in orbit around the moon if the command module couldn't perform its return burn. Young and Duke waited in the lunar module while engineers on Earth frantically analyzed the oscillations, running simulation after simulation to determine if the problem was real or merely an instrumentation glitch. For 6 hours, an eternity when you're orbiting the moon waiting to learn if your mission is canceled, the fate of Apollo 16 hung in the balance. Engineers eventually determined the oscillations were harmless and the mission could proceed, but the moon landing nearly didn't happen because of a steering system backup that wasn't even being used for any critical maneuver. 24. In 2004, Spaceship One pilot Mike Melville nearly lost control of the commercial spacecraft during its first flight above 100 kilometers, the internationally recognized boundary of space, when the vehicle began rolling unexpectedly during rocket motor burn. The roll reached 90 degrees, with the spacecraft nearly inverted, before Melville managed to regain control using a combination of aerodynamic surfaces and reaction control thrusters. The unexpected rotation took the spacecraft miles off its planned trajectory, though Melville still reached the target altitude and earned his commercial astronaut wings. Had the roll continued or occurred at a different phase of flight, when the vehicle was in a more vulnerable configuration, Melville would have had no options for survival. Spaceship One had no abort systems, no ejection seat, no escape capsule, no parachute that could save the pilot if the vehicle became uncontrollable. The roll was caused by aerodynamic asymmetry in the vehicle's configuration that test flights hadn't revealed because the vehicle hadn't been pushed to such high speeds and dynamic pressures before. Melville earned his astronaut wings partly by surviving an emergency nobody had anticipated in a vehicle designed with no backup plan for emergencies. 25. Astronaut Haida Marie Stephanician Piper experienced an embarrassing but potentially dangerous moment during a 2008 spacewalk to repair the International Space Station's solar array drive when her tool bag floated away and she instinctively lunged after it, temporarily losing her grip on the station structure and entering an uncontrolled attitude away from anything solid. The bag contained over $100,000 worth of specialized tools needed for the repair work, and Stephanician Piper's instinctive attempt to catch it before it floated away put her in a dangerous position where she briefly had nothing to hold on to and no way to control her movement. She regained her grip on a handrail and the spacewalk continued using her partner's tools, but the incident demonstrated how easily an astronaut could lose control during what seemed like a simple recovery attempt. On Earth, dropping something and reaching for it is completely natural and safe. In space, the same instinct can send you tumbling away from your spacecraft with no way to stop. The lost tool bag was tracked by ground radar until it burned up in the atmosphere months later, and mission controllers had to develop workarounds for the repair tasks that required the lost tools. 26. In 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz test project, the historic first joint mission between American and Soviet spacecraft, nearly ended in tragedy when the American crew inhaled toxic nitrogen tetroxide fumes during their descent and landing. A switch had been left in the wrong position during the landing sequence, allowing attitude control thrusters to continue firing while the cabin ventilation valve was open. The thrusters used nitrogen tetroxide as propellant, and the fumes were pumped directly into the cabin where the crew breathed them. Commander Tom Stafford felt his lungs burning and realized something was terribly wrong, but they were already descending through the atmosphere and couldn't do anything to stop the entry. Stafford managed to get oxygen masks on the entire crew while they continued their descent, breathing through masks while toxic fumes filled the cabin around them. All three astronauts were hospitalized for 2 weeks after landing with chemical pneumonia that could have been fatal if exposure had continued longer. The historic mission of international cooperation and goodwill nearly killed its entire crew because someone flipped a switch incorrectly during the descent checklist and nobody caught the error before it started pumping poison into the cabin. 27. During a 1984 Space Shuttle Discovery mission, astronaut George "Pinky" Nelson attempted to capture a malfunctioning satellite called Solar Max, using the Manned Maneuvering Unit jetpack and a capture device called the Trunnion Pin Attachment Device. When the capture device failed to latch onto the satellite properly because of an unexpected sunshade extension that blocked access, Nelson tried to manually grab the satellite and stabilize it, an improvisation that wasn't in any procedure. His attempt caused both himself and the 5,000-pound satellite to begin tumbling uncontrollably. For several frightening minutes, Nelson struggled to stabilize himself, while the massive satellite threatened to knock him further into space or damage his suit. He eventually returned to the shuttle, and the satellite was later captured using the shuttle's robot arm rather than astronaut intervention. The incident demonstrated how improvising during spacewalks could create dangerous situations that proper planning would have avoided, and that the instinct to just grab it that works fine on Earth can create uncontrollable situations in space where every action has an equal and opposite reaction. 28. In 1992, Space Shuttle Endeavour's maiden voyage nearly ended in disaster when debris from the solid rocket boosters struck the orbiter's heat shield during launch, damaging protective tiles that would be the only thing between the crew and 3,000-degree re-entry temperatures. The crew was completely unaware of the damage until after landing, when ground inspectors found significant impacts that had penetrated nearly through the tile layer to the aluminum structure beneath. The tiles were designed with margin, meaning they were thicker than absolutely necessary, but the damage demonstrated that this margin could be consumed by a single debris strike during launch. If the damage had been slightly worse, a few more tiles struck or the strikes occurring at different angles, the shuttle could have experienced burn-through during re-entry, where superheated plasma would have penetrated the vehicle structure and caused catastrophic failure. The debris strike was caused by foam insulation separating from the external tank during the violent vibrations of launch. The exact same type of damage that would destroy Columbia 11 years later, killing 7 astronauts and ending the shuttle program's belief in its own safety. 29. Cosmonaut. Vladimir Komarov became the first human being to die during a spaceflight when Soyuz 1 crashed into the ground at high speed in 1967 after its parachute system failed during descent. But the tragedy was preceded by an extraordinary act of heroism by his backup, Yuri Gagarin, the first human ever in space, who desperately tried to take Komarov's place on the mission because he knew it was doomed. Gagarin and other cosmonauts had identified over 200 structural problems with the Soyuz 1 spacecraft during pre-flight preparation and knew the mission had a high probability of failure. They submitted formal objections through every channel available, but political pressure from the Kremlin to launch before the May Day celebrations meant their warnings were ignored. Komarov reportedly knew he was almost certainly going to die, but flew anyway because refusing would have meant his backup. Gagarin, the beloved hero of the Soviet Union, would have died instead. The Soyuz 1 mission was plagued with problems from the moment it reached orbit, including a solar panel that failed to deploy and attitude control problems. Komarov struggled to complete even basic mission objectives before beginning his re-entry. The parachute lines tangled during deployment, and the reserve chute became fouled in the failed main chute. Komarov's capsule hit the ground at over 400 miles per hour and burst into flames. The Soviet space program had killed one of its cosmonauts by ignoring safety warnings from its own people, and nearly killed its greatest hero through institutional refusal to acknowledge known risks. 30. In 2007, a computer virus infected laptops aboard the International Space Station, spreading through the station's network when an astronaut brought an infected USB drive containing personal files from home. The virus, called GamiMod-AG, was designed to steal passwords for online games, not exactly sophisticated cyber warfare, but its presence demonstrated that malware could potentially reach critical station systems through crew personal devices. The infected laptops had to be isolated from station networks and cleaned, while cybersecurity experts on the ground worried about what might happen if a more destructive virus reached station control systems through the same pathway. Space station operations weren't compromised, but the incident revealed that the most technologically sophisticated outpost ever built by humans was vulnerable to infection through something as simple as an astronaut wanting to bring family photos and perhaps some games to orbit. The station's network architecture was redesigned to better isolate personal devices from critical systems. 31. During the Gemini 4 mission in 1965, astronaut Ed White conducted America's first spacewalk. 23 minutes of floating outside the spacecraft that made him a national hero. But he almost didn't make it back inside because the capsule hatch wouldn't seal properly after he returned. White and Commander James McDivitt struggled with the hatch mechanism for several minutes, while their oxygen supplies dwindled and mission control grew increasingly concerned. The hatch used a gear mechanism that had worked perfectly during ground testing but behaved differently in the vacuum of space, and McDivitt had to use a ratchet tool to force the gear mechanism into position and create a seal. If they'd been unable to seal the hatch, the spacecraft couldn't have survived re-entry. The cabin would have depressurized at altitude or burned through when atmospheric friction heated the improperly sealed edge. The first American spacewalk nearly killed its astronaut, not during the glamorous EVA itself, but during the mundane task of closing the door afterward. 32. In 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry over Texas, killing all 7 crew members in the final minutes of what had seemed like a successful 16-day science mission. The disaster occurred when superheated atmospheric gases penetrated a hole in the wing's leading edge, a hole that had been created 16 days earlier during launch, when a piece of foam insulation broke off the external tank and struck the wing at high speed. Engineers at NASA had noticed the foam strike on launch video and recognized it was larger than normal. Some requested satellite imaging of the orbiter in space to assess potential damage to the heat shield, believing the strike could have caused serious harm. But management denied the imaging request, deciding the strike was not a significant safety concern based on previous flights where foam strikes hadn't caused catastrophic problems. The crew was never informed about the potential damage to their spacecraft. They had no opportunity to inspect their wing, attempt repairs with materials aboard the station, or await rescue by a second shuttle. They didn't know they were riding a mortally wounded vehicle until their instruments showed unusual readings in the final minutes, and by then it was far too late. 7 astronauts died partly because engineers asked for more information and management said no. 33. Astronaut Jerry Linenger experienced multiple emergencies during his eventful 1997 stay aboard the Russian space station Mir, including the fire described earlier and a close call when the station's attitude control system failed during a crew handover period. With both the departing and arriving crews aboard, 6 people depending on the station's systems, Mir began tumbling slowly through space as its gyroscopes failed to maintain proper orientation. The rotating station periodically lost power as solar panels swung away from the sun, plunging the crew into darkness and silence as fans and equipment stopped. They worked by flashlight to troubleshoot the problem, while the station's batteries slowly drained and atmospheric systems faltered. Linenger later described the aging Mir station as literally falling apart around us, and wrote that he spent his entire mission uncertain whether he would return to Earth alive. The station was saved through a combination of thruster firings and gyroscope restarts, but the incident demonstrated that space stations require constant vigilance and that systems can fail in cascade when something goes wrong. 34. In 1995, cosmonaut Valery Polyakov aboard Mir accidentally opened a Progress cargo ship hatch before confirming the seal between the cargo ship and the station was complete, briefly exposing the station interior to the possibility of depressurization. Alarms sounded throughout Mir as pressure sensors detected the developing breach, and crew members rushed to reseal the hatch before significant atmosphere was lost. The incident lasted only seconds before Polyakov realized his error and closed the hatch, but it demonstrated how a momentary lapse in procedure, opening a door without verifying it was safe to do so, could threaten an entire space station and everyone aboard. Polyakov had been in space for over a year at that point, setting records for long-duration spaceflight, and fatigue may have contributed to the error that almost vented Mir's atmosphere into the cargo ship. 35. During Apollo 14, astronauts Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell nearly became lost on the lunar surface when they became disoriented during their geological traverse to Cone Crater, a feature they were supposed to reach, sample, and photograph. The lunar surface offered few recognizable landmarks because everything was the same shade of gray. Distances were extremely difficult to judge in the airless environment, with no atmospheric haze for reference. And the astronauts' printed maps didn't match what they were actually seeing because the maps had been made from orbital photographs at different sun angles. Shepard and Mitchell climbed slope after slope, each time expecting to see the crater rim beyond, only to find more gray slopes rising ahead of them. Mission Control, watching their biomedical data and tracking their position from Earth, grew increasingly concerned as the astronauts consumed oxygen and suit-cooling water faster than planned while getting no closer to their objective. Controllers eventually ordered them to turn back to conserve consumables for the return trip, and they abandoned the crater traverse with Cone Crater still unseen over the next ridge. Later analysis of photographs and tracking data showed they were approximately 100 feet, just 30 meters, from the crater rim when they turned back. The third moon landing nearly stranded its astronauts on the lunar surface because navigation on the moon without GPS or visible landmarks turned out to be almost impossibly difficult. 36. In 1971, astronaut Alan Shepard hit golf balls on the moon during Apollo 14, becoming the first person to play golf on another world. a stunt that NASA approved partly for public relations value and partly because Shepard was Alan Shepard and had earned the right to do whatever he wanted. But the act of swinging a makeshift 6-iron while wearing a bulky Apollo spacesuit nearly caused Shepard to lose his balance and fall on the lunar surface. The Apollo suits were rigid enough from internal pressure that astronauts who fell over sometimes couldn't get back up without assistance from their crewmates. And a torn suit from a fall would mean death within minutes, as the astronauts' air supply vented into the vacuum. Shepard managed to keep his balance through the awkward one-handed swings, but mission controllers watching on television held their breath with each attempt. Playing golf on the moon made great television, but the risk of falling in a pressurized suit while swinging a club wasn't something anyone had trained for or planned contingencies around. 37. Cosmonaut Sergei Krikalev was stranded aboard the Mir space station for months longer than planned when the Soviet Union collapsed beneath him in 1991, and the newly independent Russia initially lacked the funds to bring him home. Krikalev had launched as a Soviet citizen and would eventually return as a citizen of the Russian Federation, a different country than the one he'd left. During his unexpectedly extended stay, he watched television coverage of his home country dissolving into multiple independent nations, saw the flag he'd launched under become obsolete, and genuinely didn't know when or if anyone would send a spacecraft to retrieve him. His return had to be negotiated between the new Russian government and the former Soviet space program, which now existed in a kind of bureaucratic limbo. He eventually returned safely after 301 days in space, but his mission demonstrated how factors completely beyond any astronaut's control, political and economic chaos on the ground, could strand people in orbit when their home country couldn't afford to bring them back. 38. In 1969, the Apollo 12 lunar module Intrepid nearly ran out of fuel during its descent to the Ocean of Storms, because Commander Pete Conrad flew a longer approach than planned to avoid landing in a crater. The precision landing, Apollo 12 was targeting a small area near the Surveyor 3 probe that had landed years earlier, required Conrad to fly past several potential landing sites that he rejected as too rocky or too close to craters. The fuel quantity warning light illuminated during the final descent phase, indicating less than 60 seconds of fuel remained in the descent stage tanks. Conrad continued his approach, made his selection, and set Intrepid down on the lunar surface with fuel to spare. But barely. If he'd had to abort the landing because of fuel exhaustion, the ascent stage would have had to fire immediately with essentially no margin for error, in a rushed emergency rather than a controlled ascent. The third moon landing nearly ran out of gas because its commander was being careful about where he put down. 39. Space shuttle astronauts experienced multiple close calls with ammonia, the toxic coolant used in both the shuttle's and the International Space Station's thermal control systems. In several incidents spanning the shuttle program's history, ammonia leaked inside the spacecraft or contaminated spacesuits during EVAs, requiring emergency procedures to prevent crew exposure to a chemical that is immediately dangerous to life and health at relatively low concentrations. Astronauts who returned from spacewalks with ammonia contamination on their suits had to wait in the airlock for extended periods, while the contamination was vented to space before they could enter the main cabin and remove their suits. One wrong valve operation or unexpected leak could have pumped ammonia directly into the crew cabin, creating a toxic atmosphere that would have incapacitated or killed the crew within minutes. The shuttle flew for 30 years with this risk, accepting that the thermal control system was necessary and that ammonia was the best available coolant despite its toxicity. 40. During Space Shuttle Atlantis' final mission in July 2011, the very last shuttle flight in history, a piece of debris struck the windshield during ascent, creating a visible crack in the outer pane of the multi-layered windshield assembly. The shuttle's windshields were designed with multiple panes specifically because debris strikes during launch were a known hazard, and the outer pane could be damaged without compromising crew safety as long as the inner panes remained intact. However, the crew flew the remainder of the 13-day mission and performed their re-entry knowing their windshield was cracked, uncertain whether the inner panes would hold under the stresses of atmospheric entry or whether the crack would propagate. The windshield held, the mission concluded successfully, and Atlantis landed safely at Kennedy Space Center to end the shuttle era. The final shuttle mission could have become the final shuttle tragedy because something hit the windshield in the first few minutes of flight. 41. In 1966, the Gemini 9 mission nearly killed astronaut Gene Cernan during a spacewalk when his spacesuit's environmental control system failed to handle the heat generated by his body during physical exertion, causing him to overheat and nearly suffocate inside his helmet. Cernan's task was to test a rocket backpack called the Astronaut Maneuvering Unit, but simply getting to the backpack and strapping himself in required tremendous physical effort in the bulky suit. His heart rate exceeded 180 beats per minute. Dangerous territory for any athlete, let alone someone in a spacesuit. His body heat overwhelmed the suit's cooling capacity, causing sweat to accumulate inside the helmet where it couldn't be wiped away. The sweat eventually covered his visor completely, leaving him effectively blind. Cernan made his way back to the capsule entirely by feel, unable to see handholds or the hatch, with his heart pounding and his body on the edge of heat stroke. He later described the spacewalk as the closest he ever came to dying. Early spacesuit designs nearly killed their wearers because engineers had underestimated how hard simple tasks become when you're fighting against a pressurized suit in microgravity and can't wipe the sweat from your eyes. 42. Cosmonaut Alexei Leonov, who nearly died during the first spacewalk when his suit ballooned in the vacuum, faced death again during landing when his Voskhod 2 capsule's automatic re-entry system failed, and he and Commander Pavel Belyayev had to perform a manual re-entry and landing, something that had never been done before and that they had to figure out in real time while falling toward Earth. The manual re-entry put them off course by over 300 miles, landing in a dense Siberian forest in the middle of winter rather than the planned recovery zone. They landed in snow so deep they couldn't open their hatch at first, and when they finally got out, they found themselves surrounded by wilderness with wolves and bears as their nearest neighbors. They spent 2 nights in the frozen forest, huddled in their spacecraft for warmth, before rescue teams could reach them on skis. The first spacewalk mission nearly killed both its crew members not once, but twice. First in the vacuum of space and then in the frozen wilderness of Siberia, because their landing system failed and nobody could find them for days. 43. In 2013, a coolant pump failure on the International Space Station forced an emergency spacewalk on Christmas Eve, when astronauts Rick Mastracchio and Mike Hopkins had to replace a malfunctioning pump module to restore the station's cooling system before critical equipment overheated and failed. Spacewalks normally require extensive preparation, days of equipment checks, suit verifications, and procedure reviews. But this repair couldn't wait. The astronauts suited up and went outside in much less time than normal EVA preparations require, increasing the risks of equipment problems or procedural errors. Both astronauts completed the repair successfully, working in the strange limbo of space where one side of their suits was illuminated by harsh, unfiltered sunlight, and the other side faced the absolute black of shadow. The emergency demonstrated that space station breakdowns require immediate dangerous responses regardless of crew readiness, holiday schedules, or personal concerns. When a critical system fails, astronauts suit up and go fix it, or everyone aboard might die. 44. During Apollo 15 in 1971, astronaut James Irwin experienced heart irregularities while working on the lunar surface. Abnormal cardiac rhythms detected by the biomedical sensors in his suit and monitored with increasing concern by flight surgeons at Mission Control in Houston. The irregular heartbeats appeared during periods of heavy exertion on the steep slopes of Hadley Ryle, where Irwin and Commander David Scott were conducting geology traverses. Doctors debated among themselves whether to tell the crew about the irregularities or whether to order an early end to the EVA, eventually deciding to let Irwin continue while monitoring his heart rate closely and hoping the irregularities would resolve. The heart problems were likely caused by potassium deficiency, resulting from the astronauts' limited diet combined with the heavy physical demands of working in a spacesuit on the moon's surface. Irwin returned to Earth and continued his astronaut career, but he later suffered multiple heart attacks and died of a heart attack in 1991 at age 61, younger than many of his fellow astronauts. Exploring the moon literally gave Jim Irwin heart problems that may have shortened his life. 45. And finally, every single crewed space mission in human history has involved risk calculations that would be considered completely unacceptable in any other human endeavor. Astronauts routinely accepted mortality risks of 1 to 4% per mission during the shuttle era, odds that would cause any factory, airline, railroad, or other workplace to be shut down immediately by safety regulators. The Space Shuttle program lost 2 vehicles and 14 astronauts in 135 missions, a fatality rate of roughly 1% per flight. During the Apollo program, astronauts flew missions where internal NASA estimates gave them roughly a 5% chance of dying. Early cosmonauts flew on spacecraft with even worse odds. Every astronaut who has ever launched into space has accepted that they might die doing it, that some malfunction nobody anticipated could end their life 250 miles above any possible help, that a meteor smaller than a pea could punch through their spacecraft hull, that a fire could consume their atmosphere, that a computer could malfunction and send them tumbling into the void, and that all the training and technology in the world cannot eliminate the fundamental danger of leaving Earth. The dumbest thing astronauts have consistently done is agree to fly in the first place, accepting risks that the rest of us would never take for any salary, trusting their lives to systems designed by humans and operated by humans who are fully capable of making any of the mistakes described in this video. They fly anyway because they believe the exploration of space is worth the risk, because someone has to go first, because the view from 250 miles up is worth dying to see. And every astronaut who has survived to return to Earth and hug their families has done so partly through skill, partly through excellent engineering, and partly through pure luck that nothing went catastrophically wrong on their particular mission. The astronauts who died, Komarov, the Soyuz 11 crew, Challenger, Columbia, and others, weren't less skilled or less careful than those who survived. They were victims of system failures, design errors, management decisions, and bad luck that could have happened to any crew on any mission. The only difference between a successful mission and a fatal one is often nothing more than which particular things happened to go wrong, and whether those particular things were survivable. Space exploration continues because humans have decided that the benefits outweigh the risks, but the risks remain terrifyingly real, and every successful mission represents another roll of the dice that happened to come up in humanity's favor. Here's the brutal truth about spaceflight. We've been sending humans into the most hostile environment in the known universe for over 60 years, and we've been making potentially fatal mistakes the entire time. Every astronaut who has come home safely has done so despite systems that can fail in unexpected ways, procedures that can be done incorrectly by tired and stressed humans, and errors that can compound into catastrophe faster than anyone can respond. The real mission was the terrifying risks they accepted along the way. Every spacewalk, every launch, every re-entry, every moment floating 250 miles above Earth with nothing but a thin hole and a few inches of insulation between you and instant death. Each represents a moment when a small mistake could become a fatal disaster, and we've been remarkably fortunate that more missions haven't ended in tragedy. History's lesson is clear. Space is absolutely unforgiving of human error, but humans make errors constantly because that's what humans do. The only reason space exploration has succeeded as well as it has is because the astronauts and engineers and mission controllers who make it possible are extraordinarily good at catching mistakes before they become fatal, at recovering from emergencies through quick thinking and trained responses, and at learning from every close call, so the same mistake doesn't kill the next crew. And sometimes, more often than anyone would like to admit, pure luck intervenes when skill and systems aren't enough. Subscribe if you appreciate the astronauts who risk their lives to expand human knowledge and capability. And remember that every time a spacecraft returns safely to Earth, it represents a victory against the infinite number of things that could have gone wrong but didn't. At least not fatally, at least not this time. Sleep well tonight knowing that right now, as you read this, humans are floating 250 miles above your head on the International Space Station, trusting their lives to systems designed by other fallible humans, and that tomorrow they'll wake up in microgravity and do it all over again, accepting risks that would terrify most people, because someone has to explore the universe, and they volunteered to be the ones who go first.